There is a house in Buckinghamshire, in the Vale of Aylesbury, above the small village of Mentmore, where the November light comes down off the chalk ridge so flat and grey that the windows look like sheets of slate set into honey-coloured bathstone. The wind smells of wet hawthorn and turned earth. The lawns are uncut. The drive is patched with moss. From the avenue you cannot see the rooks, because there are no rooks anymore. They left when the house went silent. What you are looking at is Mentmore Towers, 3 stories of golden Bath ashlar rising in 4 corner towers above a Jacobean facade modelled deliberately on Wallerton Hall in Nottinghamshire. 80 rooms, 700 acres of formal park, a great hall as tall as a small cathedral, modelled on the courtyard of the di Caserta in Naples, where the fireplaces were not built but transported stone by stone from the Doge's palace in Venice. The first English country house with central heating in every room. The first English country house with hot and cold running water on every floor. The first English country house in which an electric light was ever switched on. The first. Not a castle, not a palace, not a royal residence. Mentmore is where the richest family in 19th century Europe built the most technologically advanced private house on earth and filled it with the contents of Versailles, and where, 99 years later, the British state stood by and watched while every object in it was carried out through the front door and sold to the highest bidder in 6 days. Mentmore is where England murdered its own inheritance in public, on camera, in 1977. Mentmore is where the Heritage Lottery Fund was born too late. This is the dark story of Britain's most abandoned country house, Mentmore Towers. If you find these deep investigations into Britain's great houses and the hidden lives within them worth your time, please subscribe to this channel. Leave a comment telling me which estate we should explore next, and help these stories reach the audience they deserve. It begins with a banker and a hill. Meyer Amschel de Rothschild was born in 1818, the youngest of the 7 Rothschild brothers who, between them, ran the largest private bank in Europe. The London branch was his by the time he turned 30. He was liberal, intellectually restless, fond of horses, and uninterested in the kind of Italianate villa his elder brother Lionel had built in Piccadilly. Meyer wanted a country seat. He wanted English ground, and he wanted it built to a scale that would make every neighbouring landowner in the Vale of Aylesbury understand immediately and without further explanation that a new dynasty had arrived. In 1850, he bought the manor of Mentmore. The village sits on the western edge of the Chiltern Escarpment, where the chalk runs out and the clay begins. From the top of the ridge, you can see, on a clear day, the spires of Oxford and the towers of Windsor. The previous manor house was a modest brick affair, indistinguishable from 1,000 others scattered across the home counties. Meyer pulled it down. The demolition began in March 1851. By the autumn of that year, the foundations of the new building had been pegged out across the chalk in lime and string, and the village of Mentmore had been told, in the careful manner that the Rothschilds employed when they were about to spend a fortune, that there would be 3 years of building work, and that every able-bodied labourer in the parish would have employment for the duration. He commissioned, as architect, Joseph Paxton. Paxton was the most famous designer in England. He had built the Crystal Palace for the Great Exhibition of 1851, the glass building that had drawn 6 million visitors to Hyde Park in 5 months, the building that had announced to the world that Britain was the workshop of the planet. Paxton was a gardener by training. He had begun his working life as a 16-year-old garden boy at Battleston Park, 2 miles from Mentmore, in 1819. He had no formal architectural education, but he had the trust of Prince Albert, and he had married a man called George Henry Stokes, his son-in-law, to handle the structural drawings. Stokes had been articled to the architect Edward Blore and could draw a load-bearing wall properly. Paxton supplied the vision, the technological courage, and the contacts. Stokes supplied the maths. Between them, with Meyer Rothschild's open checkbook behind them, they had 3 years and unlimited budget. Together, between 1852 and 1854, Paxton and Stokes built Mentmore Towers for Meyer de Rothschild for £200,000. £200,000 in 1854, over 25 million in modern money, for a private house in a village of fewer than 300 souls. The decision to model the building on Wollerton Hall was Meyer's. Wollerton, built in the 1580s by Sir Francis Willoughby, was the most extravagant Elizabethan prodigy house in England, a building designed not to live in, but to overwhelm. Meyer had visited Wollerton in 1849 in the company of his cousin, and had walked the perimeter of the building twice in silence before he turned to the architectural draftsman accompanying him, and said, in writing now preserved in the Rothschild archive in London, that this was the silhouette he wanted, but built better, built warmer, and built with electricity in mind. Wollerton had no electricity in 1849 because the world had no electricity. Meyer Rothschild proposed to build a country house wired for a technology that did not yet exist commercially. Paxton agreed. He routed conduits behind the panelling of every room. They sat empty for 26 years. Meyer wanted the same effect at 3 times the scale, with all the technological advances of the industrial 19th century concealed inside an Elizabethan silhouette. Paxton delivered it. The 4 corner towers were not defensive, they were declarative. They said, "A Jew has arrived in the English countryside, and he has built the biggest house any of you will ever see." The house was, the year it was completed, the largest private residence built in England since Blenheim Palace 140 years before. It had 80 rooms over 3 principal stories and a basement service floor that ran the full footprint of the building. It had a stable block for 60 horses. It had a private water tower with a reservoir of 50,000 gallons fed from a chalk spring on the estate. It had, concealed in the basement, an enormous coal-fired boiler that piped hot water through cast-iron radiators into every room. Inside, Meyer assembled what would become, by the time of his death 20 years later, one of the 3 or 4 greatest private art collections in Europe. He bought in Paris through the dealer Alphonse de Rothschild, his cousin. He bought in Venice through the agent Antonio Cara. He bought from broken estates in Vienna and Florence, and from the trustees of bankrupt French aristocrats whose grandfathers had fled the guillotine with the deeds of their tapestries sewn into the linings of their coats. Brussels tapestries acquired from the dispersal of the Versailles royal furniture during the French Revolution, 6 of them, woven for Louis XIV and unaccounted for between 1793 and 1817. Paintings by Boucher, including a celebrated portrait of Madame de Pompadour. Sevres porcelain by the cabinet load, including a tea service made for Marie Antoinette in 1779, and another made for Catherine the Great of Russia in 1782. Renaissance bronzes, 18th century French furniture of the highest grade, including a writing desk by Riesner that had stood in the bedroom of Louis XV at Versailles. The marble fireplaces, lifted whole from the Doge's palace in Venice and shipped to Buckinghamshire at a cost that nobody, even at the time, would confess. The Great Hall, with its galleried first floor and its enormous coffered ceiling, was an exact reproduction of the central courtyard of the royal palace of Caserta in Naples, scaled down by a third and roofed with iron and glass. The roof was the single technical achievement that justified Paxton's appointment as architect. He had pioneered the iron and glass roof at the Crystal Palace. He repeated the trick at Mentmore, scaled down, weight-bearing, weatherproof, and invisible from the ground. The great hall could be flooded with daylight at noon in June and lit by gas lamps in the winter evenings, and, from 1881 onwards, by electric incandescent bulbs, of which the first was switched on by a footman. Then, on the evening of 14th of December, 1881, Joseph Bird, the head footman, climbed a small wooden ladder in the great hall and turned a brass switch on the wall. A carbon filament inside a hand-blown bulb made by the Edison Swan Company glowed orange. The first electric light in any English country house came on. The Times reported the event the following week in a 4-line note on the inside pages. The Buckinghamshire Advertiser sent a reporter who described the bulb as glowing with the steady amber of a small autumn moon, but without flicker and without smoke. The bulb is still there. It has never been replaced. It has not been lit since the receivership. Meyer died on 6th of February 1874. He left Mentmore and his fortune to his only child, Hannah de Rothschild, who was 23. The will was published in the London Gazette and ran to 14 pages. Hannah inherited, in cash and securities, £2 million, which made her, at 23, the richest unmarried woman in Europe. She also inherited the contents of Mentmore Towers, valued for probate at £1 million and known by every dealer in London to be worth considerably more. Hannah was, by the standards of her time and her sex, an astonishing woman. She read in 5 languages. She managed the estate herself. She had been educated by private tutors and by her mother, Juliana Cohen, who had died when Hannah was 12. She inherited not just Mentmore, but her father's seat in the city and her father's seat in the Liberal Party. And in 1876, she met, at a Liberal political reception held at Lansdowne House in Berkeley Square, the man who would become her husband. Archibald Primrose, 5th Earl of Rosebery, was the most brilliant young man in the Liberal Party. He was 29. Hannah was 26. He was Eton, Oxford, and a celebrated orator. He had no money. She had a fortune of £2 million. They married on 20th of March 1878 at the Board of Guardians in Mount Street in a civil ceremony attended by Prime Minister Gladstone, with a religious blessing at Christ Church, Down Street afterwards. The only form available to a marriage between a peer of the Church of England and the daughter of an unbaptized Jewish banker. The marriage was happy. They had 4 children. Rosebery moved into Mentmore with the enthusiasm of a man who had married into the future. For 16 years, Mentmore was the political salon of the British Liberal Party. Gladstone came down from London at least twice a year between 1878 and 1894 and slept in the south-east guest bedroom on the first floor, which the Roseberys, after his last visit, locked and reserved for him as a permanent room. The bed in which he slept was made up afresh once a fortnight, whether he visited or not. So did Rosebery's friend Henry Asquith. The German Chancellor Bismarck sent his son. The Prince of Wales, Bertie, who would become Edward VII, was a regular weekend guest, arriving by private train at the new Mentmore Halt that the London and North Western Railway had built in 1880 specifically to serve the Rothschild house. The state dinners served in the dining room were cooked by a Hertfordshire-born woman called Eliza Cook, who had come to Mentmore in 1894, a second cook, and who would, by 1900, be running the kitchen. The dinner menus, drawn up by Hannah herself in her own hand, are preserved in the Rosebery papers at the National Library of Scotland. They run to 11 courses and were served on the Sevres dinner service originally commissioned by Catherine the Great. The wine, supplied from Mayor Rothschild's cellars at Mentmore and from the Rothschild estate at Chateau Lafitte in the Médoc, was decanted by a butler called Edwin Pollock, who served the Roseberys from 1879 until 1908. Pollock's name appears in the wages book at £60 a year, rising to 72 by 1905. We do not know his face. We know that he was Lincolnshire-born, that he had a wife called Annie, and that he retired to a cottage on the estate which the 5th Earl gave him rent-free for the remainder of his life. But there was something brittle in the marriage from the beginning, in the way there always is when a wife is rich, and a husband is brilliant, and the wife is 26, and the husband is 32, and the world wants the husband to be Prime Minister. Hannah managed the politics. Rosebery managed the speeches. The Liberal Party in the late 1880s split bitterly over Irish Home Rule, and Rosebery, who was Foreign Secretary in Gladstone's last 2 administrations, found himself running a foreign office, while his wife ran his political diary, his hospitality, and his domestic finances. They had 4 children in 11 years. The boy, who would become the 6th Earl, was born at Mentmore on 8th of January 1882. the succession was secure. The succession would, 65 years later, become the problem. On 5th March 1894, Rosebery became Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, succeeding Gladstone at the age of 46. He held the office for 1 year, 3 months, and 17 days. He was the last Liberal Prime Minister to govern from a country house. He was also, by his own admission, the most miserable man ever to have held the office. His wife was already ill. The cabinet papers of his short administration, released by the Public Record Office in 1985, show that Rosebery wrote nothing in his own hand for the first 6 weeks of his premiership. The cabinet secretary, Sir Algernon West, recorded in his journal entry of 18th of April 1894 that the Prime Minister had been at Mentmore for the previous 12 days, sitting in the boudoir adjoining his wife's bedroom, reading aloud, and refusing all formal correspondence. His wife was already ill. Hannah de Rothschild Rosebery contracted typhoid in the autumn of 1890. She died on 19th of November 1890. She was 39. Rosebery never remarried. He outlived her by 39 years. He continued to use Mentmore for political weekends, but the great hall in which his wife had presided was, after 1890, a room that he entered as little as possible. He spent most of his last decades at Dalmeny in Scotland and at the Durdans in Epsom. Mentmore was open for shooting weeks in the autumn and closed again in the winter. The carbon filament bulb in the Great Hall was lit perhaps 100 times between 1890 and 1929. Rosebery died on 21st of May 1929. The estate passed to his grandson Albert Edward Harry Meyer, Archibald Primrose, 6th Earl of Rosebery, who was 37 and who had no interest in living at Mentmore at all. He used it as a country storeroom for the Rothschild collection. The marbles were still on the walls. The tapestries were still in the corridors, but the rooms were closed and shuttered, the windows shrouded in calico, and the heating was switched off in October and on again in May. Eliza Cook, by then in her 60s, retired in 1929 after 35 years in the kitchen. The 6th Earl wrote her a personal letter of thanks. It survives in the Rosebery papers at the National Library of Scotland. The 6th Earl died on 31st of May 1974. The estate passed to his son, Neil Archibald Primrose, 7th Earl of Rosebery, who was 45. The 7th Earl inherited Mentmore Towers, its 80 rooms, its 700 acres, its complete art collection, still hanging on the walls in the positions Meyer Rothschild had chosen for it in the 1850s. He also inherited a death duty bill of £4.5 million. He could not pay it. In January 1977, the 7th Earl gave notice of sale. On the 14th February 1977, the Earl, through his solicitor, and through the offices of Lord Goodman, the family trustee, made a formal offer to Her Majesty's government. He would sell the contents of Mentmore Towers in their entirety in situ to the British nation for £2 million. The Sotheby's auction estimate for the same contents, prepared 2 months earlier, was £100 million at the floor and rising. The Heath government had previously been offered the contents in 1974 for £3 million and had refused. The Wilson government, in February 1977, was offered them at £2 million. On 21st February 1977, Denis Healey, Chancellor of the Exchequer, refused. The refusal letter was 3 paragraphs long. The Chancellor wrote that, given the present economic circumstances of the country, including the recent loan from the International Monetary Fund and the public expenditure constraints under which the Treasury was operating, the acquisition of the Mentmore collection at a sum of £2 million could not be justified to the House of Commons. He suggested that the contents be sold at auction in the usual way, and that individual lots of particular national importance could, if they came forward, be acquired by the relevant institutions out of their normal acquisition budgets. Hugh Jenkins, the Minister for the Arts in Healey's own government, fought the decision inside the cabinet for the next 6 weeks. Jenkins, a former actor and a Labour intellectual, understood what was being lost. He pressed for a special Treasury grant. He pressed for an Arts Council intervention. He pressed for the National Land Fund to be activated. He was overruled at every meeting. On 11th of March 1977, he was told privately by the Chief Secretary to the Treasury that the matter was closed. He did not resign. He stayed in office, in silence, until the sale was over, and then he resigned 6 months later. On 17th of March 1977, Sotheby's published the catalogue. It ran to 5 volumes. It was 12 inches thick when stacked. Every one of the 2,000 lots was photographed. The catalogue itself, before the sale, sold 30,000 copies. It is still the most comprehensive single record of a private English country house collection ever published. The complete set is now held at the Sevres Mentmore Archive in Aylesbury. On 18th of May 1977, the sale opened. Marcus Linnell, the Sotheby's auctioneer in charge, took the rostrum in the Great Hall at 10 o'clock in the morning. The room was full. There were buyers from the Metropolitan Museum of Art, from the J. Paul Getty Museum, from the Louvre, from the Rijksmuseum, from the Victoria and Albert. There were dealers from Paris, Geneva, New York, and Hong Kong. The British government had sent nobody. The first lot was a Sevres tea service. It sold in 90 seconds. On 19th of May 1977, the second day, the Brussels tapestries went. The set of 6, acquired by Mayor Rothschild in 1856, from the dispersal of the French royal collection, and never on the open market since, were sold individually. 3 went to the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, and are now hung in the Wrightsman galleries. 1 went to the Louvre in Paris. 1 went to a private buyer in Geneva who has never permitted public exhibition. 1 went to the Victoria and Albert Museum, the only Brussels tapestry from Mentmore now in a British public collection, acquired by John Pope Hennessy on behalf of the V&A out of an emergency grant from the National Art Collections Fund of £62,000. The Boucher portrait of Madame de Pompadour, listed in the catalogue as Lot 152, hammered down at £64,000 to an anonymous bidder later identified in the Sotheby's records as the J. Paul Getty Trust. The painting now hangs in the Getty Center in Los Angeles. Roy Strong, the director of the Victoria and Albert Museum, was sitting in the back row of the room when the hammer fell. He wrote in his diary that evening, in an entry not published until the year 2000. The phone has not stopped ringing. I have been sick all day. It is over. We have lost it. On 22nd May 1977, the 5th day, the Caserta marble fireplaces were sold. They were dismantled stone by stone over the following month and shipped to 4 different countries. On 27th May 1977, the sale closed. Marcus Linnell brought the hammer down on the final lot at 4:20 in the afternoon. The total, raised across the 6 days, was £6.39 million, against the auction estimate of £100 million and against the offer to the Treasury of 2. Walter Hadland, the Mentmore estate manager who had served the family for the previous 8 years, supervised the packing of the contents as they left the building. He worked through the night for the last week of May 1977. He wrote, in a private letter to his wife dated 26th of May, that he had felt, watching the lorries pull out of the avenue, like a man attending the funeral of a friend who was still alive. On the 31st of May, 1977, Hansard recorded the parliamentary debate. Hugh Jenkins, who had been silent for 6 weeks, stood up in the House of Commons and spoke. He spoke for 14 minutes. He spoke without notes. The passage that has been quoted ever since, recorded verbatim in the parliamentary record, Mr. Speaker, we have not lost a collection. We have lost a country house, and we have lost it because we, this house, were not willing to spend in a single year the sum we would otherwise spend in a single day on much less. Bevis Hillier, writing in Country Life the following week, said it more plainly. Mentmore was murdered while England watched. We will not see its like again, Roy Strong, in an interview with The Times on 4th June 1977, called the sale a tragedy of the first order, the worst single act of national vandalism since the dissolution of the monasteries. John Cornforth, the architectural historian at Country Life, who had visited Mentmore in the months before the sale and who had photographed every room in its complete state, wrote a 30-page article that has been the principal scholarly account of the loss ever since. Marcus Binney, a young architectural correspondent at the Times, founded a campaign group called Save Britain's Heritage in direct response to what had happened at Mentmore. Save Britain's Heritage would 17 years later be the principal lobbying organisation behind the creation of the Heritage Lottery Fund. The empty house went on the market for £2 million. There were no offers from the British state, from the National Trust, or from any institution. In 1978, the building was sold to the followers of Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, the Indian spiritual teacher who had taught the Beatles to meditate in 1968. The Maharishi's transcendental meditation movement paid £240,000 for an 80-room country house with 700 acres of parkland. They renamed it the European capital of the Age of Enlightenment. They held meditation conferences in the Great Hall. They did not turn on the carbon filament bulb. For 30 years, the Maharishi's organisation kept Mentmore standing. They patched the roof. They cleaned the floors. They held conferences and lectures and yoga retreats in the rooms where Gladstone had drunk port. They installed, in the Great Hall, the world headquarters of what they called the global country of world peace. They built, in the South Park, a flat-pack wooden meditation pavilion, of which the planning permission ran out in 2003 and which was never demolished, and is, in 2026, still standing, weathered grey and roofless in the long grass beyond the orangery. The bulb in the brass fitting was not touched. The Sotheby's catalogue still sat in the librarian's office. The Save Mentmore archive in Aylesbury preserves a photograph taken in 1989 of the Maharishi sitting cross-legged in the Caserta-modelled Great Hall on a white cotton mat beneath the unlit Edison swan bulb that had been lit by Joseph Bird 108 years before. In 1999, the Unification Church of Sun Myung Moon considered buying the property and withdrew after a single weekend's inspection on grounds of the building's structural condition. In 2007, the Maharishi's organisation, by then in financial difficulty, put the house on the market. In 2008, Simon Halabi, a Syrian-born Lebanese property developer who had made a £1 billion fortune in the central London commercial real estate, bought Mentmore Towers for £35 million. He announced a plan to convert the house into a 200-bedroom luxury hotel and spa with 3 restaurants, a casino, and a helicopter pad. Planning consents were lodged. Architects were appointed. The marble fireplaces were to be replaced, where possible, by replicas. Furniture was commissioned. Halabi committed £25 million of his own capital to the conversion. On 15 September 2008, Lehman Brothers collapsed. By March 2009, Simon Halabi's property empire, which had been valued at £4 billion in 2007, was insolvent. He was declared bankrupt with personal debts of £3 billion. It was, at the time, the largest personal bankruptcy in British legal history. The case was reported on the front page of the Financial Times on 30th of March 2009 under the headline, "Largest Personal Bankruptcy in UK History Filed in High Court." The receivers appointed were the London office of BDO Stoy Hayward, who took possession of the Mentmore freehold on 14th of April 2009. Mentmore Towers passed into receivership. The hotel project was abandoned. The fittings already installed for the conversion, including 6 unfitted Italian marble bathroom suites still in their crates in the basement, were left where they stood. The house was boarded, locked, and surrounded with security fencing of 6'6" height, topped with razor wire. The Sotheby's 1977 catalogue was removed from the librarian's office by the Save Mentmore campaign in October 2009, with the receiver's consent, and is now archived in Aylesbury. The Edison swan bulb was left in its socket on the express instruction of English Heritage. It has remained in that condition for the past 17 years. In 1994, the National Lottery Act had created the National Heritage Memorial Fund's lottery distributor, the Heritage Lottery Fund. The legislation had been drafted in direct response to Mentmore. Marcus Binney, who had founded Save Britain's Heritage in June 1977 in the immediate aftermath of the Sotheby's sale, gave evidence to the parliamentary committee that drafted the bill across 7 sessions in 1992 and 1993. The transcripts are in Hansard. Binney's central submission, repeated in every session, was that the British state had failed at Mentmore not for want of will, but for want of an instrument, that no statutory mechanism had existed in 1977 by which the Treasury could acquire a privately owned heritage asset above its market disposal value, that the National Land Fund had been administratively starved, and that the only durable solution was an arm's-length distributor with a guaranteed annual income stream independent of the Treasury's annual settlements. The Lottery Act delivered it. The Heritage Lottery Fund has, since 1994, distributed over £8 billion to more than 50,000 heritage projects in the United Kingdom. It has saved cathedrals, manor houses, industrial buildings, and entire town centres. It has not been able to save Mentmore. Mentmore is in private receivership. The fund cannot act on a building it does not own. The Save Mentmore Towers campaign, founded in 2010 by a group of local residents and former employees of the Maharishi organisation, has lobbied continuously for 15 years for the building to be vested in the National Trust, or in English heritage. The campaign has gathered, by 2025, 18,000 signatures on a petition addressed to the Department for Culture, Media and Sport. The department has, on each of the 3 occasions the petition has been delivered, replied that the matter is for the receivers and the secured creditors of the Halaby estate, and that the department has no statutory power to compel a private disposal at less than market value. The campaign has not yet succeeded. The campaign continues. The 7th Earl of Rosebery died on 23rd March 2015. He was 85. He had outlived the sale he had ordered by 38 years. He had not entered Mentmore Towers, by his own statement, since 1979. His obituary in the Times described him as a quiet, courteous, lifelong horseman who had once been forced, by circumstances beyond his control, to dismantle the most important Victorian art collection ever assembled in England. The film income has, since 2008, been the only thing keeping the building from total structural collapse. Stanley Kubrick filmed the interiors of Eyes Wide Shut in the Great Hall in 1998 and 1999, dressing the room as the Long Island mansion of the Masked Ball, and shot for 14 consecutive nights with the Edison Swan bulb visible in the upper right of 3 of the establishing wide-angle takes. Christopher Nolan filmed Batman Begins in the same room in 2005, dressing it as the Wayne Manor Ballroom for the sequence in which the young Bruce Wayne's father is murdered in the alley adjoining a charity gala. Brideshead Revisited returned in 2008. The Crown filmed multiple sequences there across the first 3 series, dressing the dining room as the Buckingham Palace State Dining Room and the Great Hall as the Ballroom at Windsor. Each production pays a fee in the order of £50,000 to £120,000 per shoot. The fees pay for the security fence, the patched roof, and the minimum legal compliance required of a Grade 1 listed building in receivership. Nothing more. But the house that astonishes the film crews and the curators of the Save Mentmore archive was not built by the Baron, whose name is carved into its founding charter. Their presence at Mentmore is documented, recorded in ink on paper, in ledgers held at the National Library of Scotland, and in the parish books of Mentmore village. Their stories are not. There was a head footman called Joseph Bird, who was born in 1838 in the Buckinghamshire village of Ledburn, and who entered service at Mentmore in 1860 at the age of 22. He served the Rothschilds and then the Roseberys for the next 25 years. He was paid £48 a year in 1881, with board and lodging in the upper servants' wing. We know he had a wife called Mary, who lived in a tied cottage on the estate. We know he had 3 children, 2 of whom survived to adulthood. We know that on the evening of 14th December 1881, 21 months after Thomas Edison filed the commercial patent for the carbon filament incandescent lamp, Joseph Bird climbed a wooden ladder in the Great Hall at Mentmore Towers and switched on the first electric light ever lit in an English country house. We know that the bulb he lit is still in the socket. We know that he retired in 1885 and that he died in 1903. We know nothing else. There was a head cook called Eliza Cook who came to Mentmore in 1894 as second cook and who took over the main kitchen in 1900. She served the 5th Earl, the Dowager Countess, and the 6th Earl across 35 years. She was paid £80 a year by 1920. We know she cooked 5 state dinners for sitting prime ministers between 1894 and 1922, including Gladstone in 1894, Asquith in 1908, and Lloyd George in 1919. We know her menus survive in the Rosebery papers. We know she had no children. We know she retired in 1929, that the 6th Earl wrote her a letter of thanks, and that she lived for another 7 years in a cottage in Mentmore village, where she died on the 4th of February 1936. We know nothing else. There was an estate manager called Walter Hadland who took up the post in 1969 and who served until the sale was complete in 1977. He had previously been head gardener at a smaller estate in Hertfordshire. He was 61 in 1977. He supervised the cataloguing of the contents in the months before the Sotheby's sale. He supervised the packing of every one of the 2,000 lots as they were removed from the building. He gave written evidence to the House of Commons Select Committee on the National Heritage in October 1977, in which he said that he had watched the contents leave Mentmore with the calm of a man who has been told that there is nothing further he can usefully do, and the certainty that what was happening was wrong. His evidence is among the published parliamentary papers. We know he retired in 1978 and that he died in 1991. We know nothing else. They appear in the records as footnotes, a name beside a sum, a quarterly wage entered into a bound ledger, and then they vanish into the silence that swallows everyone in a great house who is not a member of the family. We know that Joseph Bird lit the first bulb in any English country house and that nobody has photographed his face. We know that Eliza Cook cooked for 3 prime ministers and that no recipe in her hand survives. We know that Walter Hadland packed the funeral of his own working life and that the only document we have in his voice is a letter to his wife about the lorries. We know only that they were there, that the house they served is still standing, and that their names survived, some of them, because the Rosebery Estate Office kept its accounts, and the parish kept its books, and nobody threw the ledgers away. The house absorbed them all. Mentmore today is locked and boarded. There has been no public access since 2008. The Grade 1 listed designation, awarded by English Heritage in 1986, is the only legal protection the building has. It is not enough to compel maintenance. It is enough to prevent demolition. Beyond that, the receivers operate the building under the minimum statutory regime. The roof is patched. The drains are clear. The chimneys are netted against jackdaws. The interior is dust and damp, and the long, slow stillness of a building that has not been lived in for the lifetime of a generation. In 2018, a survey commissioned by the receivers and conducted by the conservation architects Donald Insall Associates concluded that the building's principal structure remained sound, that the Paxton iron and glass roof over the Great Hall had developed 11 small leaks but had not failed, that the bath stone facing was weathering normally, and that with an investment of approximately £28 million, the house could be returned to a habitable condition. The receivers do not have £28 million. The Save Mentmore campaign does not have £28 million. The British state, by the terms of the Heritage Lottery Fund's own statute, cannot release £28 million to a privately owned building in receivership. The survey is now 8 years old and is in the public domain. It has not been acted upon. Visitor numbers per year, as recorded in the English Heritage Register, 0. There are no public tours. There are no open days. The Save Mentmore Towers campaign hosts an annual gathering at the gates each May on the anniversary of the 1977 sale, at which the founders and supporters read aloud the parliamentary speech of Hugh Jenkins and lay a single white rose against the security fence. Approximately 60 people attended in 2024. In 2025, the figure was 41. The roses are removed by the receiver's contracted ground staff within a week, in line with the conditions of the public liability insurance under which the gathering is permitted. The campaign has, on 3 occasions, requested permission to enter the building for an inspection visit, accompanied by a conservation architect. Permission has been refused on each occasion on grounds of insurance. Annual operating cost, as reported to the receivers in 2023. £120,000 met entirely from filming fees. There has been no production at Mentmore since the autumn of 2022, when a documentary crew filmed the exterior for a Channel 4 broadcast on the British country house in crisis. The receivers have, in 2024 and 2025, drawn on the building's reserve account to meet the minimum statutory compliance. The reserves are not infinite. The Save Mentmore campaign estimates the reserve account at less than £400,000. The Heritage Lottery Fund, since 1994, has distributed over £8 billion. It has not distributed a single pound to Mentmore Towers. The fund cannot acquire a privately owned building in receivership. The receivers cannot dispose of the building below the level of its outstanding debts, which exceed £30 million. The Save Mentmore campaign has proposed repeatedly a compulsory purchase order, a National Trust acquisition, a special grant from the Department for Culture. Every proposal has met the same wall. The building is a private asset of a bankrupt estate, and the public purse has no legal instrument capable of releasing it. In 1977, the British state refused to pay £2 million for the contents. In 2025, the same state cannot, by its own laws, pay anything at all for the empty house. In the Great Hall, in the brass fitting on the south wall above the gallery, 6 feet to the left of the gallery balustrade, and 12 feet above the floor of the room that Paxton modelled on the courtyard at Caserta, the original 1881 carbon filament Edison swan bulb is still in its socket. It has not been touched since Joseph Bird put it there. The receivers have, by agreement with English Heritage, left it in place. The filament is intact. The glass is clouded with 144 years of dust. It has not glowed since November 1929, when the 6th Earl, by his own later admission, briefly switched on the original circuit on the evening after his father's funeral, and then switched it off again because he did not want to draw a power bill against an estate now in mourning. Stand at the south front of Mentmore Towers on a November afternoon. Stand at the south front of Mentmore Towers on a November afternoon, when the light comes down off the chalk ridge so flat and grey that the 4 corner towers look like cardboard set against a darker sky, and look at the building and see what is and is not there. The Bath stone has weathered, the window frames are sound, mostly. The lawns are uncut, and the avenue is patched with moss. There is a security fence at the perimeter, 6 feet high, topped with razor wire. There is a camera on the gatepost. There is a sign that says no public access. There is nobody there to enforce it, because there is nobody there to enforce anything. Through the windows, if you walk to the southwest corner and look up, you can see the wallpaper of the Boucher drawing room, where the Madame de Pompadour portrait used to hang. The wallpaper is mid-blue silk damask, mounted in 1854, never replaced. It has faded in vertical stripes, where the curtains have hung open and where the curtains have hung closed. A thin lichen has begun on the south wall of the orangery. There is, in the air, the faint smell of cold stone and old wood, and the specific dampness of a building that has not had heat in it since October 2008. The rooks have not returned. The hawthorn in the long avenue is unpruned and 40 feet tall. The pelmet boxes above the south front windows, painted in 1854 in The pelmet boxes above the south front windows, painted in 1854 in Rothschild blue and gold, have not been retouched since Hannah's lifetime. The house has the absolute composure of a building that has, by every relevant test, been forgotten by the country it once dominated, and that has, by the same tests, refused to fall down. Mentmore is not one house. It is the record, in Bath stone and Caserta marble, and a bulb that has not been replaced, of what England decided in 1977 it could not afford to keep. Meyer Rothschild wanted a country seat. The house gave him a dynasty. Hannah wanted a marriage that crossed the line between her father's faith and her husband's England. The house gave her a prime minister and a typhoid grave at 39. Rosebery wanted Gladstone's office. The house gave it to him briefly and then gave him 50 years of widowed mourning in a building he could not bear to enter. The 7th Earl wanted to discharge a death duty. The house gave him a 6-day auction and a national humiliation. Simon Halaby wanted a hotel. The house gave him the largest personal bankruptcy in British history. The Maharishi wanted enlightenment. The Save Mentmore campaign wanted rescue. The Heritage Lottery Fund wanted to prove that no future Mentmore could ever happen. The house gave them all what they asked of it, in the careful, expensive, neutral manner of a great country house accustomed to absorbing human weather. The house always gives. That is its genius. And that is its cost. And the named ones, the ones who do not appear on the title deeds. Joseph Bird, the head footman, lit the bulb that has never been replaced and walked out of the building one autumn evening in 1885 with £48 a year in his pocket and a tied cottage to go to. Eliza Cook served Gladstone his last state dinner at Mentmore and went home to a cottage in the village and died there in 1936. Walter Hadlin packed the lorries through the last week of May 1977 and wrote to his wife that he was attending the funeral of a friend who was still alive. None of the three of them owned a single brick of the building. All three of them, in any meaningful sense, were the building. Who does a building belong to? The Baron who built it in 1854 with £200,000 of London banking profit. The daughter who married a prime minister and died of typhoid at 39. The prime minister who survived her by 4 decades and never reopened her drawing room. The grandson who used it as a storeroom. The great-grandson who sold it to pay the treasury. The chancellor who refused to buy it for £2 million. The auctioneer who hammered down the Boucher in 90 seconds. The Indian spiritual teacher who held meditation conferences in the Great Hall. The Lebanese developer who went bankrupt before he could pour the foundations of his hotel. The head footman who lit the bulb that is still in the fitting. The cook who fed Gladstone. The estate manager who supervised the packing of the funeral. Mentmore does not answer. The house never answers. It simply stands, with its 4 corner towers against a Buckinghamshire sky, the carbon filament still intact in the brass fitting in the Great Hall, the lichen advancing on the orangery wall, the security camera blinking on the gatepost, the curated memory of every owner sealed inside the empty rooms and lets you decide. The original 1881 carbon filament Edison Swan bulb is still in the fitting in the Great Hall. The bulb that Joseph Bird lit on the evening of 14th of December 1881. Cold, clouded, never replaced. The Heritage Lottery Fund exists because of Mentmore. Mentmore still exists in spite of it. They are still down there. They always will be. If this story moved you, challenged you, or made you see a building differently, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment telling me which estate, dynasty, or hidden history we should investigate next. There are hundreds of these stories waiting to be told, and every one of them is hiding something beneath the surface.